Hi everyone, welcome to another Motions Debrief. My name is Datadi and I was a former debater for Ladies College. Currently, I am the coach of St. Joseph's College and the junior debating coach of Ladies College. The motion for the debrief today is the SWRD 2025 Quarters motion. The motion reads, "This House believes that the feminist movement should portray the concept of masculinity in the service of feminist goals rather than demonizing it." So before we get into case structure, note that this is a comparative motion, meaning that both sides have to weigh their comparative against each other and prove that their version is in the best interest of the actor. In this case, the actor would be the feminist movement. For the sake of being precise, the motion is not this house as the feminist movement. So it's about 6 rational individuals determining the best course of action for the feminist movement as onlookers. It doesn't really make a difference in this debate, but it's good to keep an eye out for those types of nuances when you get motions like this. Okay, let's move into the prop case, starting with context. I think it's favorable for prop to first describe what a world where masculinity is demonized looks like. So what goals does demonization attempt to achieve? How does it fail to achieve those goals? And why should we shift to a model where we redefine the concept of masculinity? So I think you can argue that masculinity has come to equal toxic masculinity because of the rise of figureheads such as Andrew Tate. What does Andrew Tate masculinity, which is what we're trying to shift away from, look like? I think you can push that it looks like a world where there is a strict enforcement of traditional gender roles, where conservative Republican narratives where the head of the household, typically a man, determines the vote prevails. Domestic labor is entirely pushed on women. It's oppressive and it involves men feeling comfortable extending the autonomy and entitlement to the women in their lives. What goals does demonization attempt to achieve? Here, I think it's important to note that both sides in this debate are likely to have similar or the same goal, just different ways of achieving that goal. So demonization attempts to delegitimize and create a deterrence for misogyny and sexism. It attempts to do this by shaming the perpetrators of these behaviors. Seems like an okay objective. What's the problem? I think the problem here with demonization is twofold. Firstly, that it alienates men and creates further segregation. And secondly, that it leads to the furthering of sexism and reduces the feminist movement's power to combat said sexism and reduces the feminist movement's legitimacy as a whole. You can go on to note that gender is subjective, meaning that different leaders, so religious leaders, feminists, Andrew Tates, define it differently at different times, and the feminist movement demonizing masculinity pushes men who feel alienated to look for other sources to validate their masculinity, because obviously it's important to their identity and how they find their place in the world. So it pushes them into incel circles or towards red pill groups. Therefore, and this is your stance, it's better for the feminist movement to take control of the narrative and to promote a form of masculinity that is not harmful and that can be celebrated. So what kind of world are we trying to get to through our model? I think you should push a world where the rising far-right incel alpha male gang is seen as an obstacle to the goal of the feminist movement, where feminists actively push away that narrative of masculinity. In your model, you need to give the alternative version of masculinity that you're presenting. How do you go about redefining masculinity, right? I think it's favorable for prop to push a narrative of masculinity where good men are seen as individuals who support women, who are active parents, who are in touch with their emotions and hold toxic men accountable and stand up to toxic men. People who protect the weak instead of persecuting them. So in this type of world, Andrew Tate masculinity is seen as negative character traits rather than inherent flaws with masculinity itself. So bad men are the problem versus all men are potential threats. Your burdens of proof then are twofold. Firstly, that demonization is counterproductive in achieving the goals of the feminist movement. Secondly, and kind of the flip side of this, that positive reinforcement is desirable and that it has unique benefits for prop or for like the world itself. Moving into your constructives, there are 3 constructives that I think prop should push. Firstly, the mandate of the feminist movement. Secondly, on the power of positive reinforcement. And a third for second speakers on relationships and how you better them on your side. So moving into the first argument, the mandate of the feminist movement, its duty to your ethos, is to empower women and create a society with equal rights and mutual respect. You can argue that demonization obstructs this mandate in 2 ways. So your first level should be on segregation. Note that segregation can happen in two ways. Firstly, where you villainize men, leading to a rise in the normalization of misandry, where women feel like men overall are a threat, that they're untrustworthy, etc., especially since masculinity and men are two conflated terms. B, this creates a cycle of alienation where men feel threatened and demonized and pushed towards red pill groups, thereby confirming the stereotypes that women already have of them. On the other hand, on your side, on prop, reconstructive masculinity is an active step to taking control of the narrative or taking back control of the narrative to counter already existing definitions of masculinity. Your second level then has 3 points under it, so critical mass. Under this, your first point should be that demonizing masculinity reduces the legitimacy of the feminist movement. You can bring in an example here about how even the word feminism has acquired a negative connotation due to misandrist rhetoric that radical third wave feminists have been pushing, where feminism has snowballed into a term like feminazis, resulting in even people who actually believe in the core principles of feminism being hesitant to identify as feminists because they don't want to be labeled as man haters. Second point then is that masculinity doesn't just apply to men. When femininity was ridiculed or seen as lesser in the past, men who presented as feminine suffered that shaming as well. So similarly, lots of women and non-binary individuals present masc and identify with that label. So the demonization of masculine characteristics will also affect them and how they're perceived in society, as well as how they perceive themselves in society. So you also risk alienating parts of the LGBTQ movement, which you can argue is detrimental to the feminist movement, because the LGBTQ movement and the feminist movement are incredibly interlinked because of the fact that they are fighting for the same cause of equality. So you're losing a huge supporter base on Opp. The overall image of the feminist movement then becomes one of reverse discrimination with no actual interest in gender equality or gender integration, and you risk coming off as hypocritical and separatist. Okay, third point under your second level is that a feminist movement that alienates men risks stagnation or loss of momentum in achieving its goals. Men are in powerful positions. You need people in power on your side to pass laws. Adding to this, you not only alienate men, but you also alienate women who like men. So women who buy into the traditional patriarchal concepts of masculinity. So noting that you are alienating parts of the LGBTQ movement, parts of male communities, as well as certain women in society, the question becomes, who exactly are you representing then on Opp, right? Because you're not even just making people indifferent, you're actively turning people against you. The counter to this is that on prop, you build stronger communities by presenting masculinity as a potential ally rather than a threat. Okay, second argument on the power of positive reinforcement. Here you should expand on how you reduce violence on prop. That should be your first level, and your second level should be on how you increase male participation on prop. These are not definite arguments that you should make. This is just what I think would be the most favorable strategy for prop to take. So under your first level, talk about how men feel less threatened and alienated on prop because they're not having an identity crisis, because they're not being villainized. On Opp, you're more likely to have a self-fulfilling prophecy where men inevitably go, you think I'm the bad guy, fine, I'm the bad guy, right? Under your comparative as prop, emphasize to the judge that value will be derived from positive acts rather than oppressive, harmful acts. So in status quo, men don't have any good role models to strive towards. Since the feminist movement villainizes them, they're pushed into echo chambers that teach them to establish value in relationships through force. Through positive reinforcement, on the other hand, where men are celebrated for being good partners and celebrated for being good people, you create a healthier environment with more productive conversations and mindset change. Your second level on how you increase male participation. Essentially that when men are seen as part of the solution rather than part of the problem, they feel more empowered to engage with feminist causes and support the movement. The unique benefit of this is that it creates a shortcut to tapping into male spaces, and you have men working with you, so you have more influence and capacity to recruit more men. This creates a unified front where both genders are working together actively to dismantle patriarchal structures. Why is this important? Because of course you need women to be involved in the feminist movement because they're the main stakeholder, but ultimately crimes against women are largely committed by men. Even if women do succeed in getting laws passed without the help of men, which is unlikely, that still won't make a difference without male participation and mindset change. Your third argument for second speakers could be on relationships. So here the first level should be on romantic relationships and with your partner or your spouse, and the second level should be on parental relationships that you have with your children. So under your first level, you can push that following the narrative of traditional masculinity pushes men to perpetuate patriarchal norms, which includes suppressing their emotions, avoiding being vulnerable, and taking an authoritative position in their relationships, leading to a power imbalance and an unequal distribution of household tasks such as parenting. Also, you can note that men in these relationships often feel emotionally distant and disconnected because they're trying to uphold a certain standard of masculinity that's been pushed on them, where they can't break down and they can't cry and they can't just be themselves. So these relationships tend to lack genuine emotional connection. As prop, you encourage men to embrace vulnerability, to embrace emotional communication, and share responsibilities with their partners, leading to healthier, balanced relationships. So I think this is the best way to frame the debate for your side. Second level then, on how this filters back into children and leads to a more positive environment created within the family itself. So here you note that children mimic parents. For example, attachment styles are entirely based on childhood experience of your relationship with parents, as well as your experience of your parents' relationship with each other. Children are more likely to develop secure attachment styles if they have good role models. And you can push that this is unique to prop because you're pushing a good model of masculinity within society, so men actually know what they need to strive towards. You can also note that demonizing masculinity will only make male children feel like they are innately bad, or that it is in their nature to be oppressive or abusive towards the women in their lives. On prop, you enable children to have the kind of ability to distinguish between having a father who just was not a good role model of masculinity for you versus fearing that you're going to turn out just like him because of the fact that you're a boy, you're eventually going to turn into a man, and because of the fact that you have that masculinity that society tells you is ingrained in you, you're going to turn out to be just as abusive or oppressive as your father might have been. So that's a prop case. Moving into the op case, let's start with recontextualization. When defining masculinity, I think you can kind of take the same lines that prop is taking to say that masculinity is not inherent, it's something that's cultivated. For the vast majority of society, men are domineering because society has told them that's how they should be. What does demonizing masculinity actually look like? Here, I think, since prop is going to be talking about alienation a lot, you can talk about how alienation only happens when masculinity and men are conflated. But does this really happen in status quo? Because the very fact that the not all men narrative has a following is because there is an understanding in status quo that bad behavior is not inherent to men. And I think society buys into this because that's why men get off on a lot of the crimes that they commit, right? So men behave badly because the patriarchy and alpha male figureheads have taught them that they should cultivate very specific characteristics and behave in a very specific way. Okay, before you get into your stance, you can push that on prop, what you're essentially doing is deconstructing and reconstructing masculinity. You're still boxing individuals under labels, and you can push that labels themselves are harmful because they repress authentic expressions of self and perpetuate the same gender norms that the feminist movement has been trying to distance itself from for decades. Your stance should be that you as Opp would demonize masculinity by demonizing gender as an institution. Your counterfactual then is a world where gender is abolished as an institution, where society strays away from generalizations, where characteristics, both positive and negative, values, aren't separated by virtue of gender. So good behavior is praised on an individual personal level, not due to one belonging to a certain group or a certain part of society. Same with bad behavior. And under your model, how do we get to this kind of world, right? How do we go about deconstructing masculinity and deconstructing gender? Here you need to note that masculinity is deeply rooted in society despite having harmful effects on all parties, right? It perpetuates because there are alpha males and men that subscribe to that kind of culture in order to validate their own identities and sense of self. So these are the men that both sides need to target. In order to tap into that headspace, you need to unlock a desire within them, right? How do you do this? On Opp, your model should be that you push already existing problems of masculinity that men already are somewhat receptive to. For example, the notion that masculinity is bad for men because it discourages and represses emotion, it cultivates apathy, and it pushes unachievable, unattainable standards of strength, of physical fitness, like looking like a bodybuilder, independence, financial security, where you can't rely on anyone, you have to provide for your family, you can't have a breakdown. And these kinds of narratives are harmful for men. And you can say that men are already receptive to these, to that model, because why else would men's rights movements exist? Why else would there be advocacy for men's emotional well-being and therapy for men and things like that, right? You can't have healthy relationships and open communication under this narrative because you're not being your authentic self. What you need to push towards these men is that the way out of that kind of stagnant, limited lifestyle is to get rid of gender norms as a whole. So your burdens then are, one, that society is better off without masculinity and gender norms, but secondly, that you reduce crimes and microaggressions against women on your side. There are three constructives again for Opp. First argument on how this motion violates a mandate of the feminist movement and reinforces gender norms. A second argument on the likelihood of success, and a third argument on incentive structures versus deterrence structures. Under the mandate of the feminist movement, you can talk about how redefining masculinity within the feminist framework, which is what Prop is trying to do, perpetuates the very gender norms that the feminist movement is seeking to challenge. How does this happen? By attempting to align masculinity with feminist goals, the movement validates the concept of masculinity. Validating masculinity thereby validates gender, validates the gender binary itself as a necessary and permanent societal force. Why is that a bad thing? Because one, people don't fit into boxes. The concept of masculinity cannot exist without the concept of femininity and the social expectations to conform to one or the other. You can't exist outside of your biological gender and its corresponding bag of behaviors that society has told you you need to cultivate. But in reality, you can push that people rarely fit into hypermasculine or hyperfeminine stereotypes because both of these are constructs that are formed by artificially assigning or attributing certain qualities that we all naturally have to varying degrees to one or the other of these supposedly two genders, right? So instead of focusing on redefining masculinity, you as Opp should push that it's better for the feminist movement to advocate for the cultivation of all positive qualities by everybody rather than sectioning off these traits by gender. So the goal should be to move away from these rigid gender norms and allow people to express themselves freely without being confined to concepts of masculinity or femininity. So that's the first argument. The second argument is on the likelihood of success. And this is where you kind of do a stakeholder analysis of essentially to say that there are three types of men who are receptive to feminist ideology who don't apply to this debate. Secondly, men who are not receptive to feminist ideologies, and the men on the fence. So the debate applies to the latter two. First level under this, men who are not aligned with feminist values. These are the types of men you should push who are still entrenched in patriarchal frameworks and norms. So they've been exposed to and typically support toxic masculinity that's advocated for by people like Andrew Tate, since they are already kind of resistant and feel reluctant or feel disconnected from traditional feminist ideologies, it's highly unlikely that the feminist movement will be able to capture their attention with a redefinition of masculinity. Why is your model as Opp then different? So here you can push that while the deconstruction of gender identity is already in action, it's still fairly a new concept, and it's still fairly, or you could say that it's a pretty radical one at that, right? Which is exactly what I think you need to push, we as a society and we as a feminist movement need, because radical change often requires a radical catalyst to spark discourse, right? This is why, for example, protests are so successful, because they get that attention and create that kind of discourse. Of course, some of the attention, maybe most of it or maybe all of it, it would be bad initially, but you have more outreach into these otherwise untappable alpha male circles, if only through creating outrage. In fact, I think it would be favorable for Opp to push that this outrage is crucial, because it forces men to engage with the feminist movement, if only to fathom why the feminist movement is taking such an extreme course of action to actually get rid of gender. So it creates a conversation about the role of gender organically, which is essential for mindset change. So on Opp, you make a good number of men question why they behave the way they do. You should argue that this is better than what you would have on Prop, where one or two of the men that you push a redefined version of masculinity to decide to play nice just so they can get in a relationship or something like that. So on Prop, there is no discussion about gender roles, and you don't have access to the Tate cult either. Second level then, on the men on the fence. So these are the types of men who already feel a disconnect with certain aspects of masculinity, but they aren't necessarily accustomed to feminist thinking. How do you cater to these men on your side? So here is where you push the narrative that gender norms suck and that they're bad for men. So gender norms tell you that you can't cry, masculinity, traditional masculine. Stereotypes tell you that you can't be emotionally vulnerable. They punish you for expressing emotion with slurs. People call you a sissy. So paint masculinity as a concept that is entirely toxic and unhealthy towards men. Most of these men are already kind of receptive to that kind of rhetoric. So you unlock that desire to escape those limited roles within them, a need to feel seen and heard. You tell them this is why your life sucks and this is how it could be better without masculinity. Adding to this note, and I think this is an important point, that men tend to be hesitant to embrace their femininity or associate with femininity from a young age. When you get told constantly that you can't cry, that you can't express yourself, that's how you learn to hate women. You can't hate femininity outside yourself before you hate the femininity inside of you. You need to deconstruct that gender norms are required for you to be valued, that they're anything but harmful to you on an individual level. Okay. So the third and final argument on Opp is incentive structures versus deterrent structures. Two levels. Firstly, where you talk about how even if the feminist movement succeeds in presenting an alternative to this toxic masculinity, you can't ensure that men will subscribe to this redefined ideal version of masculinity. Toxic masculinity is likely to persist as long as the alpha male image is seen as desirable, and it's painted to be desirable by the cult of people like Andrew Tate or Elon Musk, for a different example. People are lazy to change their bad behavior, especially when they benefit from it. Some men will cherry pick the parts of masculinity that work for them, as they always have. But, and this is your second level, why is this bad behavior even normalized in the first place? How are men able to get away with these toxic traits that they act upon, right? So here you can talk about how toxic masculinity has been accepted into our society because of the fact that gender is an institution. Outside of the institution of gender, if we were to take toxic masculinity as individual traits, then those behaviors are less likely to be condoned. When gender as a whole is demonized and deconstructed, individual traits can't be hidden behind the traits of a group. So without masculinity, your individual, even your base level misogyny gets highlighted because it's not an inherent trait to men anymore. Think about this. If a few boys are getting into a fight, it's seen as normal, right? Because that's what boys do. But if one boy punches another boy, then it becomes what he does on an individual level when he gets angry. He can be labeled as an aggressive or volatile person. Essentially, what this argument is talking about is that masculinity, like most labels, gives you the power of hiding in a crowd. The only way to get rid of that umbrella and that complacency that toxic masculinity gives bad men is to get rid of masculinity as a whole. Here you can add that deconstructing masculinity has the ability to instill fear. The fear of facing consequences such as being villainized or shamed or cancelled on a personal level. You can't hide behind boys will be boys anymore and you're responsible for your actions. Prop might argue that they're still able to hold people accountable individually, but push to the judge that it's hard to cancel one person over something that a large number of society still validates and legitimizes. So there's no incentive structure, there is also no deterrent structure on prop, and then you have to obviously prove that you do have both of these things on your side. Yeah, so that's essentially the prop and op case. I do think this motion is relatively debatable if you frame the op case as deconstructing gender as a whole. It's a little bit more difficult to go about saying you would demonize masculinity only, because the motion doesn't really give you the room to cherry pick which parts of masculinity you would demonize, because that's essentially the prop case. So I think it's fair for Opp to go about their stance as being getting rid of masculinity in order to get rid of gender, because I think there's already a trend towards straying away from the gender binary, and masculinity and femininity are already coming under fire in society nowadays. But yeah, I hope that made the debate a little bit more clear. You can find the Google Doc in the description probably below. And yeah.